Today we are hosting artist Torreya Cummings, who is featured in the current exhibition at the Library Gallery, The New West, The Natural Environment in the Digital Age. Cummings' work, which is paired with fellow artist Terry Peterson in the exhibition, offers an incisive perspective on how our experience of the natural world has been shaped by historical and fictive narratives and further defined by the technologies of our digital age. Cummings challenges our assumptions of what we think is, or what we think we know of, quote unquote, the West. In Cummings' New West, California's landscapes are recognized as computer operating systems, rivers and streams are accessible only as constructed memories, and simulated dioramas present an amalgam of history and fantasy. I want to thank artist and curator Chris Daubert, who originally proposed this exhibition for the Library Gallery. If you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to visit the gallery to see the exhibition. Both Cummings and Peterson's work is fully immersive. As a viewer, your participation, literally and figuratively, activates the work. Both artists draw from their personal stories growing up and living in Northern California, and each embraces a cumulative process in materiality and conceptual approach. The results, which include humor and whimsy, reimagine how we consider the natural environment. I also want to invite you to return for our final public program in conjunction with this exhibition, which will be on Saturday, December 3rd at 2 p.m. We are going to host a dynamic discussion with both artists, and I expect the conversation will dive into defining or redefining what we think of as a new West, and give the artists the opportunity to reflect on each other's works in relationship to their own. And I also want to invite you next week for another event, which is the opening of the Recycle of Time exhibition, which is celebrating former art department faculty members in conjunction with the 75th anniversary of our university. The exhibition is also in the Library Gallery, and the reception will take place Thursday, November 3rd from 5 to 8 p.m. So now I want to introduce today's speaker. Torreya Cummings' conceptual investigations draw together memory, art historical narratives, and a semblance of dioramas found in history museums. Their work encompasses photography, sculpture, installation, performance, and video. In their most recent work, Cummings interrogates the unsettling relationship of history and fiction, employing drag aesthetics, substitutions, hardware store materials, props, and sets to reveal the constructed nature of landscape and our perceptions of the natural environment. Cummings received a BFA from the University of California, Davis, and an MFA in sculpture from California College of the Arts. They are currently a Bay Area Fellow at the Headland Center for the Arts, which provided studio space and additional funding to help produce work in this exhibition. Cummings lives and works in Emeryville, California. Please join me in welcoming Torreya Cummings.
Cool. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. It is a delight to be here, and there are so many thoughts and ideas that went into making the work in the Library Gallery that are not necessarily obvious on the surface, and so this is a great opportunity to kind of get you into the back of house view on how some of this stuff went together. Let's see. So I just have, I'm going to start with some influences, some things that kind of go into my work generally and things that I think about and perspectives that I have. I have what they called in grad school a discursive practice, which means I can't make up my mind, so I'm kind of all over the place. I work in sculpture, installation, video, sometimes performance, photography. I'm also an amateur historian and researcher, and a lot of that interest goes into the work that I make. And yeah, I grew up outside of Sacramento, went to Davis for undergrad, and then I moved to the Bay Area in 2006, where I went to CCA for graduate school. And since then, I've kind of wandered through performance and photography, and in the last 5 years, have really kind of settled into this, like, what is landscape? What is our relationship to landscape? And particularly around California history. So let's see, let's get into some influences. Alternate dimensions and parallel worlds. When I was a kid, I got a book from the library about paranormal mysteries. And a common theme was that people were just minding their own business, walking down the street one day and like dropped into an alternate dimension and were never seen from again. And the idea that you could happen was both terrifying and exciting because, you know, I was like, it's kind of boring here. What else could possibly be out there? But then you might never come back. So later I started to think of certain kinds of places or events as being portals to these other dimensions. So like figuring out I was queer was one of those things. Like it's like a whole new world opens up that you didn't know was there. Or like when you have a dream about your house and there's another room in it that you didn't know was there. So these kinds of, anytime you get like new information that makes you see things a little differently, this is sort of a metaphor for these alternate dimensions that I'm thinking about. I'm also interested in these, oh sorry, next slide. Or, yeah, next slide. I forgot that we have two computers going. So this is sort of like a theme of the talk, is that there's this doubling and mismatch. So yes, now we're on the same slide. Okay, so history is an alternate dimension. We can't go there, but we can see some things through the signs and traces that have been left behind. And how we perceive these traces depends on how they've been interpreted for us, through fiction and through documentation. And so I think about the leftovers of history in the landscape as like a signpost to these dimensions. This is Bodie State Historic Park in California. We'll get a little bit later to a piece that I made about this place, but they keep everything in a state of what they call arrested decay. So rather than restoring it or repairing it or letting it completely fall apart, they have all these like props, and they'll replace the shingle on the roof sometimes, just to like keep it the way that it is, sort of halfway falling over. Next slide. And then this is Angkor Wat in Cambodia, but I started noticing these kinds of structures that are built to kind of hold things up in significant places that we want to remember. Next slide. There's some more of the structures. So I got really interested in these kind of parenthetical constructions. Next slide. So ruins and ghost towns and falling apart places are these signposts to other past realities. And we're moving through the present that the past made for us. And reckoning with this past is part of what we have to consider as we move forward and what kind of world we want to build. You can't just say like, well, we're just going to pretend that none of that ever happened, because like it's what happened in the past builds the world that we're dealing with now. But if things have been different in the past, it means that they can be different in the future. And when people ask about like, you know, why are you so interested in ghost towns and all of this, it's like, well, this is where I grew up. This is Slough House, which is not that far from here. And this is a hop barn that is, I think this was maybe 2005. So it is, every few years I go back and check how it's doing, and it's like not in a state of arrested decay, it's in like full decay. Next slide, please. So I'm also really drawn to fakery and exaggeration and substitution. So here's a shot of a fake ruined castle. in Kassel, Germany. It was built in the 1700s as a place for somebody's mistress. It was built as a ruin, as sort of a romantic accessory to the landscape. But now it actually is falling apart. So now it has some nice props to keep it standing. Next slide. So I used to work at the Oakland Museum of California, and as a preparator in the exhibitions department, and one of the things that I was lucky enough to work on were some of the dioramas in the natural history department. So fakery and scenery and dioramas can tell us a lot about the stories that we're telling ourselves. So you make this entire scene down to all of the fake insects on the fake plants. So you're building this really meticulous environment, but the joy of having the behind the scenes access is that you have all these moments that destroy the illusion. So they're little epiphone booties while they're being positioned in the diorama to protect them until they're ready for being installed. So you have this moment that just disrupts the whole scene, and that's one of my favorite things is when there's an illusion and then the illusion is disrupted, and you can kind of see both at the same time. So dioramas and thinking about framing stories has made a big impact on my work. I often use some of these methods, but in a less linear way. I'm not really trying to tell a complete contained story. I'm trying to give you a sense of it and then kind of break it up. Next slide. So another point of inspiration for me is the nightclub. This is also another dimension, a place of escape or discovery or transcendence or avoidance or experimentation. And I really like the flashing lights and the palette and the way that the club looks completely different in the daytime than it does at night. So this is just a moment in time from the Stud Bar in San Francisco, which is, they closed during the beginning of the pandemic, but they are still active as a collective of bartenders, and there's sort of the hope that it might open again if they can find a space. So there's this, they're in this kind of limbo space. And there's an ancient paradox called the Ship of Theseus, also known as the grandfather's axe. And with the axe example, I've replaced the handle twice and the head once, but I've had the same axe my whole life. So and the Ship of Theseus is if you have a ship and you replace each part one after another, at what point is it still the same ship, or is it something else? So this is, for me, one of those examples of if they open it up in a new place and it's the same people or some of the same people, but it's a different space and they have some of the same artifacts but not the same everything, is it still the same thing? I don't know, but I look forward to finding out. Next slide, please. So drag performance is another point of reference for me. I love that the props and effects are not all that convincing. There's a lot of cardboard. There's a lot of suspending your disbelief. And if you are dressed in black, you're invisible. So this person is floating because they're being carried by people in black, and it's kind of convincing, but not really. So that's that again. Next slide, please. Reflections, doubling, mirroring. when I was a kid, I had this like little suitcase with a mirror inside of it, and I would put it on my head, and I would walk around the house looking into the mirror to see where I was going. And it's this really like disorienting feeling, and you're trying to navigate these spaces with these tools, and everything's backwards and upside down. And that's basically what I'm trying to do with my work. I love that double vision when you have like your reflection in the window, but you can see beyond it at the same time. Next slide, please. And hardware stores. There is nothing like a hardware store for a sense of possibility for me. It's like the opposite of like the club lighting. There's no romance, but it's what you need to build the club. And there are all of these tools and supplies that they're built for one thing and intended for one thing, but I end up repurposing them a lot in my work. So when I go to the hardware store and somebody asks, what are you looking for? Can you help me find something? And I'm like, well, I need something that does this. And they're like, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to build a fountain that's also a sculpture. And at that point, they're sort of like, okay. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to get into a couple of past projects. This was at the Oakland Museum. After I stopped working there, I had an installation up for 2 years. This was Notes from Camp, and it was it's an immersive space that had to appeal to a broad audience. They have like fourth graders, retired docents, tired parents. It's sort of a broad gamut of people, which is my favorite audience, is like somebody who showed up somewhere not expecting to have an art experience, and then we're like, oh, what's this? So I was pleased to hear that the people who really liked it the most were like security guards and teenagers, because it's like, that is a tough crowd. But I wanted it to work on multiple levels. So it's a reference to Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp, but it's also broadly about camping. Next slide, please. But it was sort of a meditation on nature and how people think about nature as this sort of drab, straight, cisgender, very like some things are natural and some things are not natural. And it's like, have you seen nature though? Like there's color, there's all this like sparkly stuff. You've got hermaphroditic fish. You have shrimp who see colors we can't imagine. All of these like trippy water reflections. So I put all that in there. There's a video, a lot of reflective surfaces. So you walk into this space and it's this disorienting, reflective environment with all of these scenes from nature that are really sparkly. Next slide. So yeah, these are some giant fish. Next slide. And this is also like a classic problem I have, where I make these environments that are impossible to photograph, or impossible to like get a sense of what it's like to be inside of it. Next slide, please. So the next project I'm going to talk about is the one in Bodie. Next slide.
Is it possible to turn these lights off?
Yay!
Can you
Thank
go
you.
back to the previous slide so we can see that image because it was really washed out.
That one. Is that better?
It's a little better. It's yeah, taking photos of dark spaces without messing with the exposure too much is tricky. Okay. Let's see, we are about halfway done. So we're gonna move on. Okay, so these are some scenes from Bodhi. I wanted to do something about Bodhi because I've been going there multiple times over the last 10 years. And one of the things that I noticed about Bodhi is that there's a walking tour, and the walking tour takes you through all of these this is the house where the mayor lived, this is the house where a rich businessman lived, this is the house where this the school teacher and her family lived. And it's all very upstanding citizens. And if you read about Bodhi, you know that there were lots of murders, lots of gambling, a large Chinatown, a red light district. There was a famous gambler named Madame Mustache who got in trouble, ran out of money and drank morphine and died in the street. There are all of these really complicated stories that are happening in Bodhi, but in the walking tour, it's very much upstanding citizens engaged in commerce. So there's also a footnote that's number 27, site of the Chinatown. Next slide, please. And these are the only two buildings left from what was a really extensive Chinatown. And there was a note that was oh yeah, it burned down in a fire along with the red light district. Anyway, moving on. And it was whoa, hang on. When was this fire? Wonder what circumstances did this happen? There's all of these stories that are not, they're just sort of glossed over because it's not the narrative that they want to present. Next slide, please. So this is Arrested Decay Interpretive Site, which was, I built a wall in the gallery that was framing this large photo of an outhouse that's falling over. And then next slide. But if you start walking around and you get out of that frame, you start seeing that there's a lot going on outside of the frame. Next slide. And that is, let's see, next slide, please. Yeah, so there's two views into the piece. There's the side view where there's a lot of light and color and objects that represent various aspects of the town, and then the sort of front view where you just see, the photo of the outhouse.
Torreya, if I may ask,
Yes.
who owns Bodhi? Who?
It's the state of California, but it was donated by a family that had bought up most of the town by the time that I think it was the 60s when they donated it. So this one family had bought up most of the town by that point that was left, and then were instrumental in forging the narrative about, who the various players were. Next slide. So this was a project I did in 2019 that was non-view of the lake. from Underground is the title of this project. Next slide. So I have a antagonistic relationship, which is still a relationship, with 19th century American and Western landscape painting. I went on multiple school field trips as a kid to the Crocker Art Museum, where I was overwhelmed by all of these super romantic, grand views of the West as painted by Albert Bierstadt and various others who were engaged in this project intentionally or unintentionally to kind of sell the West to settlers. And at the time I was like, I don't like this and I don't know why, because I'm in 4th grade. And then the more I learned about it later, it's like, oh, okay, this is part of this massive project of manifest destiny. And so for this piece, I decided to look into this painting of Donner Lake from the summit that Bierstadt painted to commemorate the crossing of the Sierra by the Transcontinental Railroad. And the guy, Collis P. Huntington, who commissioned the painting, was apparently unhappy that the train did not have a more prominent place, because he wanted it to be about the train, and Bierstadt was like, yeah, but these mountains. So in trying to think about landscape and how do we think about landscape without this sort of grand view narrative, I decided to go to the tunnel itself. Next slide. So this is the tunnel in the painting. I made some field recordings and took some photos and made a video about it. Next slide. And again, I'm thinking about, what the frame is, what we cut out of the frame when we're trying to tell a story. Next slide. So that's the same photo, it's just, this is the whole scene. So from there, next slide, I started looking at these model train tunnels, which you can buy a piece of landscape to put in your model train set, and made some casts of some of these prefab structures, and one of those is in the show that's up right now. Next slide. So next slide. So I've wanted to do a piece or some work about the Cosumnes or Cosumnes River, which was in my backyard where I grew up. And I haven't, it's really hard for me to actually get there because I don't live here. But it occupies this kind of like origin story, center of the world place for me. It's like, that's where I am from, is this stretch of river. Next slide. But most of the ways that I have to sort of keep an eye on it are remote, so maps, or next slide. I keep an eye on the stream, like the volume of flow in the river with the gauge height. So this last summer and winter, I went to the place where the gauge is. Next slide. Which is just to the right of here. But one of the things that I noticed, and I didn't notice when I was there, when I was growing up, because I was an insider, but now that I'm an outsider, I started noticing all of these no trespassing signs. Next slide, please. So, next slide. Yeah, so that's, there's no trespassing signs everywhere. And so like access to the river itself is something that is really difficult for me to secure because I know like a couple people there still, but really not very many. But I did finally get, so the video that's in the show now is sort of about that experience of trying to get back to this place. That was really formative. And it references another ancient paradox, which is it's known as Heraclitus's river fragments, because there are several fragments of text that refer to this one idea that you can't step into the same river twice. But they don't know which of the fragments is authentic and which ones, and what authentic means in that context. But it's sort of the same idea that you know, I've changed, the river has changed. There's no way back to that site that I remember, but I can sometimes get to the site that is still there. So I did get to go to part of the river with a couple friends, and we, next slide please. I decided I wanted to make a diorama of the stream bed. So took some reference photos, collected some rocks. Next slide. And went about building sort of a museum diorama, but without, you know, all of the resources and the whole shop that I would usually have. So this is, it's got a foam base, and then there's some plaster bandage on top of it. Next slide. And the sand is mixed with Elmer's white glue. Next slide. And this is, I got to have a studio at the Headlands Art Center over the last winter, and it was really nice to have like just a lot of space. But then I made this thing that weighs 200 pounds, and it's up one flight of stairs. So getting it, like building a crate around it, and then I had to get like the kitchen interns to help me carry it out. And but it's pretty solid and travelable. It just has a lot of rocks in it. Didn't think about that when I built it. Next slide. Yeah, so this is one of the earlier versions of it. The one that's in the gallery now is kind of the final, I think, configuration, where there's some parts that are open and some parts that are closed off. And then there's a projection of water over it, so sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's wet. Next slide. So fire season. Next slide, please. So this was, I think it was September 8th, 2020. And if you were in the Bay Area on that day, everything was orange. This is about, I think this was about 11 o'clock in the morning. And it was really disorienting because it was dark. The sky was dark. There were fires all over California, all over the West. And most of the time, like the Bay Area, there's a breeze coming in from the ocean, or there's fog, or it's got kind of its own microclimate. So but on this day, it was like, oh shit, this is real. Fires are happening everywhere, and it's really like, it's affecting us too. And so, next slide, please. Yeah, this is like right outside my door in the middle of the day, and and everything was dark. So I was kind of chewing on this experience for a while and wanted to think about how to represent it, but it was so like encompassing that it's hard to think about, how do I make something that reflects this, that isn't like just a photograph of that time and place. Next slide, please. But I figured out that like welding curtains are almost the right shade of orange. Next slide. So this is at the library gallery, and again with the problems photographing things, like cameras don't know what to do with this color. Like it doesn't do the same thing that your eyes do. So this is probably really the shade of orange that it is, but when you're in the space, your eyes start to try to white balance. And so it ends up being this kind of warm glow. And all of the light coming in from outside turns like green, like blue-green. But this is the best we got in terms of representing it. Next slide. So those are two big welding curtains that are enclosing the space. And then, let's see, next slide, please. And let's see, so this is, the fountain piece is called Submerged Prospector. And I wanted to reference flumes and like water transportation as part of hydraulic mining. And then, next slide. And then there's the prospector. It's with the submerged prospector and the inverted tunnel photographs. It's almost like it's not trying to go back in time and change history, but it is sort of like a spell for imagining, what happens if we could reverse any of these historical events. And then if I don't know how to make something, I usually make a maquette. So that's a little, just trying to figure out what that needed to be. So maquettes are helpful. Next slide. Brief detour into art history, fantasy landscapes. Next slide, please. So there's this genre of landscape painting that's imaginary landscape or fantasy landscape, and it's like, it's not a real place, but it's sort of an imagined place, so there might be elements that you drew from life, but it's composed into a composition that's no real place. Next slide. So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with fountains, it's like, okay, well, I'll make some maquettes, and I'll make these small ceramic fountains that are referencing sort of rivers without actually referencing a specific, like the diorama is a pretty specific place. This is a general place. Next slide. It was nice to get back into clay. I did my undergrad in ceramics at Davis, but we had a new, I'm going to blame the studio manager on this one. The guy firing the kilns was doing a really aggressive job. And it's one of those, like, it could be me, but I've built things like this before and they haven't cracked. But fortunately, marine epoxy is a really powerful substance. So next slide. So it worked. I just patched it up. Next slide. So these are some of the fountains installed in the little fantasy landscape. Next slide. And then this is all of these postcards that some great grand relative of mine sent to her family back in Germany of Yosemite. And they sort of line up, but they're not, that's not really the relationship that any of those places have to each other. They're all kind of stitched together. Next slide. Okay, I've got, what, 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
5 minutes, we want to leave time for questions. Okay.
7 minutes to tell you about staffage. Next slide. So you can read that or not if you want, it's just there. So staffage are the figures that are in landscape paintings to add a little bit of life or interest, but they're not really the focus of the painting. Next slide. And one of the things that happened when people started introducing figures into these landscape paintings was all of these like clip art books and broadsheets started coming out. Next slide. So people would go around and sketch figures in, working often in the English countryside, in the case of the book that I'm working from, so that artists who had no idea what rural labor was like could refer to something to see what people were doing, so that they could have something realistic to put in their painting. Next slide. So I love this title. Picturesque groups for the embellishment of landscape in a series of above 1,000 subjects comprising the most interesting accessories to rural and domestic scenery, shipping and craft, rural sports, pastimes and occupations, naval, military, and civil employments, implements of trade, commerce, and agriculture, etc., for the embellishment of landscape. So, next slide. So there are all of these, next slide. All these figures doing various things. So I started noticing these more and looking for them. Next slide. And they're everywhere. Next slide. And they're usually kind of like sketchily drawn. They're not big on detail because they're not really the point. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And next. How about another one? Next slide. Yeah, so a lot of times people are doing some kind of labor. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. So I started thinking about how I can incorporate this into the landscapes that I was thinking about. And drawing on that connection with labor, I was thinking about like what are the most viewed landscape photos that everybody is familiar with. And one of the most, I think it's the most viewed landscape photograph in the world, possibly photograph, is the Windows XP screen, like desktop, which it's the green and blue image there, which is cut off. But if you go to the show, you can see the whole thing. Next slide. So I was thinking about these as like, when you're a viewer in the space, you are the figure in the landscape. And you're probably, if you're looking at these a lot, you're performing labor. So I have the reference to this sort of office environment. Next slide. This is Mojave from the Mac operating system. And that is an empty fountain that's continually recirculating. So thinking about drought and deserts and desertification. Next slide. And then I just included the book as of all of these illustrations in the little office environment. And that is pretty much the tour of the show. It's my last slide.
I'm going to turn up the lights, but we would invite questions from the audience now. Victoria. Sorry, now your eyes are all adjusting.
So I feel like you've highlighted a very linear progression of where the influences and how it leads to the execution of the pieces. Is there ever any moments within that execution that help you realize something about it that you hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, I think often when I am working on a new body of work or a new piece, I can kind of like see it in my head, kind of realized pretty fully in advance. But then the process of actually making it, things inevitably change because there's something I didn't account for, or material didn't work the way that I thought it would, or I didn't know how to do a process, and so I had to like learn something, or somebody else came in to help me with it, and then it ends up being, you know, like it started somewhere and it ends somewhere, and there's a lot happening in the middle where it's like they don't quite line up afterwards, and then in that distance between the original vision and the outcome, there's usually something where like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way, and now that I'm looking at it in real life, it's doing something else, and that's exciting, you know. It's like if I had it all figured out ahead of time, like I wouldn't need to make it, you know. But usually there's a pretty strong relationship between what I was thinking. But that's also why having other people interact with it or view it is really helpful, because I'm putting something out there for people to connect with that I'm trying to communicate, but there's other people have different perspectives and will reflect something back to me that I find really interesting and informative. I can't think of a specific example, but yes.
Well, specifically, actually, you were referencing the exhibition in the Oval Museum that was up for 2 years, and it seemed like that was a comprehensive study that you had drawn conclusions from, that these populations really responded to the work.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just curious. Can you expound on that? Because I think, you know, you had said the teenagers and someone else.
Security guards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the security guards, right.
Yeah. I knew that, you know, part of their goal in programming it was they wanted to connect with a broad audience. So they didn't want something that was like too specific in terms of like my agenda or my perspective. And so I thought about, you know, it's got to be durable, it has to be ADA accessible, it has to be something that, like, I want all of this like crunchy theoretical stuff in there, but I also want it to be appealing on a sensory level, and having that be broad enough that you know, there's multiple doors in, and that's like why I use humor a lot, and why there's this element of sort of the ridiculous or the fantastical, is because like if you want like a really dry theoretical conversation, like you could read the thesis I wrote 10 years ago, but like please don't do that. You know, it's like, yeah, I have things I'm putting in there, but ultimately I want people to be able to have something that they have a way in, and they have a way to connect with it. And I don't want it to be a conversation for like 5 people in New York. You know, like I want 5 people in New York, but I also, like, the conversation is as big as, you know, I'm not really making like pop art, but I do want it to be accessible enough that there's like, you can find a window in, you can find something to engage with about it, and then that feeds back to me where like I can hear about, if I get to talk to people, I can hear about like what it reminds them of or what it makes them think about.
I'm just going to throw in quickly an aside for the California Suites piece. It's been interesting to hear who comes in and who recognizes which image. Because we do have this very big divide between the Mac users and the PC users. So there's some people like, oh, that's Windows, but I don't know what the other things are. I'm like, oh, I've never used a Mac before. So that's been super interesting to me.
When my mom came to see the show, she was like, oh, did you take these pictures? They're beautiful. I'm sorry.
I completely missed it too. So thank you for the explanation. It helps so much.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's funny because they are these really beautiful images, and I tried to find like photo credits, like who, but they keep that very quiet. It is really difficult to find out who actually, or what team actually took those photos. Because the second question my mom asked was like, well, do you have permission to use these photos? It's like, nope, I do not. But I guess if they sued me, that would be like another piece. So.
We're talking in our class a lot about research-based art practices, and so I wonder what advice you have for someone looking to build a research-based practice. What are some of the ways in which you structure your research in relationship to your art making?
That's a great question. I think what I find is that I sort of envy artists who are like, I go into the studio, I work in the studio, I make things, and then they're done, and then I put them in a show, and then somebody buys them, and that's it. And I'm like, that sounds great, but that is not what I do. It's like, there are times when I don't go to the studio at all because I'm like looking on the internet, or I'm like going to sites, and I'm going to museums, and if I'm really lucky, I'm going through archives. And like that stuff takes time, and I don't always know what the outcome is going to be when I'm in the research phase. So usually it's this, and I've been doing this long enough that now I kind of have some comfort with the timeline where like, I don't know what I'm doing now, but I'm just gonna like take all this material in, and then I'm gonna find something that's like, oh, and then I have to figure out what to do with it. And then something will show up in my mind where I'm like, oh, okay, that's what I'm gonna do with it. So that research for me is not, it doesn't always make it visible at the other end. But that research is part of what generates the ideas for the projects. Sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not, which is part of why I was excited to like come talk about some of this stuff, because like staffage, it's not really super visible in here, but it's like pretty key to how this piece got made. So yeah, just get used to having a longer timeline, and there's lots of different ways to approach research-based practices too. So find something that works for you, and then like learn that that's what this is what I need to do this. It's probably gonna be different.
When you're doing your research, do you often put the documentation in as part of the installation, or is that something that only is
I usually don't, partly because when I'm going to shows and looking at work, I don't always have the attention span to like dig into somebody else's research. And I also don't assume that the things that are exciting to me are necessarily like on the dry side of like, well, I've been looking at these stream flow reports, you know, pretty regularly, but like, does anybody need to know how much water is in the river? Like I do, but nobody else really needs to know that probably. But that is something that I have kind of wondered about and might try at some point, is figuring out like what of that research can be represented in a way that makes sense in an installation.
So mine's research-based too. So you were saying you were tracking the, sorry, I'm blowing the spelling, the Gonzales River. Are there any other rivers that you're tracking, just out of curiosity?
No, there aren't. And now I'm gonna have to think about that. I think if, like, this was a site where, like, I kind of got to do what I wanted to do. But if I were doing a residency somewhere or doing something at a different location, I might get into like what's happening at that place in more detail. Sorry, way in the back.
How do you, or I guess how did you land? Like I know that you were already interested in immersive spaces, but how do you feel like that communicates your idea to like the great system?
There are things I think that happen sort of viscerally when you're in a space and you're surrounded by it that don't happen when you are outside of something and looking at it. And so for me, like with the fire season piece, with the welding curtains and the light, that was something that I wanted to have be all-encompassing, and then also when you're looking through the curtains into the outside, like it changes the whole world. And that I don't think I can get from another way of working. But I also make, discrete objects and photographs. So it sort of depends on like what the piece requires, because not everything needs to be this immersive experience, but some things do. Jim?
I just wanted to comment, not a question, but that your tracking of the Casumnas River struck me as because it's personal. Mm-hmm. And I'm very moved by that. Thinking about you in Emeryville, but you're thinking about that river over there. I was born and raised in Auburn, and I think about the American River. And it has never occurred to me to track it or watch it the way, I'm very, that's very moving that you do that. And I wouldn't seem necessarily that other rivers would necessarily be interesting to you in that way, that there's something old there for you that's very moving. It's a beautiful thing that's invisible and that it's personal, and it's quite wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I think a lot of the work that I make doesn't necessarily read as personal at the end of the outcome, but it all it is in various ways. Like that is sort of built in, where it's like these are my interests, these are my experiences, this is my perspective, and so like I'm interested in thinking about and talking about these larger social and political issues and historical issues, but it's coming from a place of personal experience and perspective. And then like this piece, one of the things I didn't mention is like I have had a day job for several years now where I'm one of the aspects of it is managing a computer lab, or managing computer labs at an art school. So I am looking at these operating system wallpapers daily, and usually I try to keep some aspects of the day job just completely divorced from the art world, but also it is a place of, I spend a lot of time there, and these things kind of creep in and then come out in these various ways.
In your sort of revisionist history of the West, your region, you seem to have there's an implicit critique, of man's interventions, like manifest destiny. But you also seem to have a kind of fondness for these bohemian, the cropping up of these buildings. So do you? How do you? Not that you have to reconcile that, but what do you think man's or human beings, role is or has been?
Well, I think there is that. It's the thing about romance, where it's romance is a tool, but it's also, I'm susceptible to it as well, and so I think a lot of the work has this ambivalence where it's I love this, and also it's a problem, and with all of the fire season piece and the burned forests, because we've practiced fire suppression for the last 100 years, and before that, indigenous landscaping practices allowed for burning, and part of the reason that we are where we are is because we forced that to stop. So I don't know, there is a profound ambivalence there, and that's part of, if I just like something, I don't have to make work about it, and if I just hate something, I don't have to make work about it. But if it's this what do I do with this? That's, how I feel about the West, and, a lot of other things besides. And that's where, the juicy stuff is. It's I don't know what to do with this. And that's why I have to keep wrestling with it.
And I think we can all relate to that, that space, it's just, that's very effective.
Could I make one small observation, which I think has to do with the majority of the work in this show, but the way, and you're talking about an immersive situation, that I think the way the show is organized and planned, the empty spaces between the pieces are actually really part of the pieces. And I had a very unnerving sense walking from this piece back to the riverbed of palpable feeling of time travel, which is very upsetting.
Time travel is never comfortable.
But the space is to allow the viewers just that half bit of comprehension, and kind of an emotional check-in. It's very, very effective, and I think that has to do with the majority of your work.
It also has to do with gallery staff being super helpful and accommodating in terms of where can we put this? Can we move this over here? Can we move this over here? How do we, where do we put this stuff so that it has a relationship, but it's not piled on top of each other? And yeah, so glad it worked.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Was fire season designed for that space, or was that something you had in mind prior? It's a very mundane question, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Yes, it was designed for that space because I knew when I first came to the gallery to think about, before I even knew what was going to be in the show, and this is like a weird sort of luxury of time where like I was talking with Chris about the show in 2019, and then it was supposed to be in 2020, and I had this like ambitious list of work that I was going to have no time to make, and then it was supposed to be in 2021, and then it got, so I had some time to think about, you know, I knew I wanted to use that outdoor space, and I knew I wanted to put some water features in it, but I didn't know like, what they would be. And then when I was thinking about that, you know, the quality of the light, and figured out that like a welding curtain would do what I wanted it to do, and then I was like, wait, what if we made the whole thing orange? And we did. And yeah, they make welding curtains in almost any size from industrial suppliers. And yeah, so it was something I wanted to do, but it just, you know, it wouldn't have, like that space is perfect for that. So I got to build it for that space.
And it is perfect for that space.
Anyone else?
Any questions? I want to thank our audience for coming and coming with some great questions, and thank you, Torreya, for a wonderful talk. The exhibition, I encourage you. We are open today until 4. Our hours are Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 4, and Saturday, 12 to 4.